One time I was talking to Avril Ra, who's a drummer that I play with in Ernest Dawkins' band, New Horizons Ensemble. And he played with Sun Ra for a long time. One thing that I remember him saying was that if you only deal with like stuff that you know, then the information that you have to draw from is finite. But if you draw from the unknown, possibilities are infinite. That's pretty much what I try and do with music, is pursue the unknown. So that you have an infinite amount of resources to draw from. So I'm always looking for stuff, sounds you've never heard, or different approaches and things. I mean, it's so many different ways that you're taught to deal with the process, the creative process, but a lot of it really doesn't have to do with confronting like the spirit of experimentation and, you know, really like pushing whatever it is you're dealing with to like get to the point where you're actually doing something that's creative and new and fresh to you, you know. And so I decided if I was gonna deal with music, I wanted to make it like as good and new and weird as possible.
For some reason, I started buying Cream magazine when I was like 9 because they had it at the 7-Eleven near our house, and I would buy it, and you know, I knew who some of the bands were, you know, your Led Zeppelin and whatnot. You could have Led Zeppelin and Van Halen on the cover, but inside there would be, you know, an article on Pere Ubu or like, you know, the Dictators or something like these bands that I had never heard of, but they must have been the same because they were in the same magazine with Led Zeppelin, and I figured, okay, Led Zeppelin, Pere Ubu, it's all the same. And that would like kind of, you know, I guess, for lack of a better word, trick me into listening to other music like that. My first year of high school, I would be reading, you know, still reading Cream magazine, and my 9th grade English teacher, Susan Hull, saw me reading it in class one day and sort of took me aside, and I just figured I was in trouble. But it turned out that her husband was a record reviewer for that magazine, Robert Hull, and so she just started bringing me records to listen to that she thought I might like. So I think in my first year of high school, within the first month, I had heard White Light, White Heat, and you know, I think she brought me the Nuggets compilation and a bunch of other stuff, and my mind was completely blown at that point. That was like best teacher ever. I mean, I played all the time, I just never was in any bands or anything, and I would just, you know, make up songs or play other people's songs for my own amusement. It never even occurred to me that I could actually do it, you know, professionally, until I saw the Minutemen, or at least saw a picture of them, because I was aware of their music before I ever really knew what they looked like or had any of their records, because, you know, they would be played all the time on this college radio station, WTJU, and when I saw him, and I saw D. Boon, I saw what he looked like, I was like, wow, he looks like me. It's like, look at him go, look at him pogo. Wow, that can't be right. You know, rock stars are supposed to be skinny English guys. I just remember him, like, playing a Les Paul, and it looked like it was strung up around his neck. You know, it was just sort of like he was wearing it really high, or maybe that was just a function of his size or his strap. And, you know, I remember it was way up high, and he was wearing these really big boots and just jumping up and down. And it was just like, good Lord Almighty, I'm set free. It was such an exhilarating experience to, like, see a great big guy like me just letting it all hang out and like playing music and not being at all self-conscious about, like, you know, what he looked like or anything, and just realizing that that just wasn't important. And all of a sudden it just dawned on me that, like, wow, you know, I could do that. And I think that was probably the most like liberating thing I had ever seen, and I still think about it all the time.
Oh God, Braden. I don't look old, do I? I think that for anybody, you know, their early formative years when a big movement hits them is probably going to shape the way that they behave for the rest of their lives, so hence the hippie movement and everything else. But for us it was punk, and it was essentially a musical movement, but there was so much involved in it. You know, just the notion of, which is disappearing more and more now, but the notion of community and people who were able to just meet and listen to something and not necessarily have to be even blown away by it, but just enjoy and then leave. And I think that kind of resonates for me a lot, and it resonates for everyone who's in the band I'm in, and I think it definitely applies to all the people who have stuck it out this long. And I think that's probably the most inspirational thing, you know, looking around at people who you can see are doing it for essentially all the right reasons, and sometimes, you know, to a great cost to themselves, you know, their livelihoods, everything else kind of being offered up for this thing that they love to do. I mean, basically, you know, we always make this joke that punk rock ruined our lives because you could never, because you were so, if it really meant something to you, that whole ethos seems to have kind of seeped into everyone who was involved in it at that time. It was definitely a movement that just had so many things attached to it. It wasn't just about music, it was about politics, but also this credo that, you know, is something that you did outside of the industry. And I suppose that's the thing that was kind of valuable, because then you could exist over time. You know, you didn't have to judge yourselves by all the criteria that usually apply. I think that's why I kept going so long, and how all of us did, because we didn't have those definitions that you had to make money or you had to sell records to continue making music. You know, especially with something like the Mekons, where it almost seems to be irritating that we keep going that long, even to ourselves sometimes. And that's where punk, I suppose, shaped and defined us. And so I would say it has to go back to that. That's the thing that pretty much drives me and drives the people I work with.
12, 13, 14, flying solo. Shall I begin? I remember, as a young child, studying music. There was a time, specific time, when I gained a completely thorough understanding of how musical tone could be subdivided, as in a mathematical sense, of fractions, and how this knowledge could be applied to my physical state using my four limbs. Does that make sense? The concept of bodily coordination between the limbs?
not inspired by all the records that I have. I'm intimidated by them. I mean, I can't live up to that. And look, I mean, I've got thousands of them, and you know, it's like, what can you do with that? I mean, I love it all, and I have big emotional attachments to music. Inspired by recorded music, there's nothing inspiring about it. It's put me out of a job, you know? It's like, what more could you say, you know? Listen to this James Brown album or something. You're like, fuck you, you know, well, who needs you? I've always had trouble with all the records I own. They're just, and you listen to them, and you're not practicing because you're listening to music all the time. You're like, I'm not getting, and I'm still baffled by, I mean, I didn't go to music school, and I've been picking it up as I go, you know. The language of music is baffling to me. You know, like in Chicago, like all the architects were inspired when it burned to the ground. Then they were really inspired because they had a lot of work to do. Well, we've got all this music around. That is not inspiring. If you could destroy it all, then there'd be a lot of work for musicians, you know. It's like recorded music is, like it would have probably been a lot easier to do it before it was around.
Go ahead when you're ready.
When I was a small child growing up in the 70s, my mom was a singer in a lounge band, and her drummer gave me a pair of drumsticks, which I proceeded to take, and I'd always sit in my room listening to the radio with my drumsticks, and I would become like, you know, all the drummers that I would be listening to on the radio. I'd sit there in my corner and air drum along to all kinds of things, and one day I'd be, you know, the drummer for the Steve Miller Band, or the drummer for Hall & Oates, or Elton John, or whatever. And as I got older, my uncle started buying me records, and he would, you know, buy me pretty cool records when I was a kid, like Roxy Music records and stuff. One year he gave me like the Inmates record and the Beat record, which, you know, I thought, you know, that's cool. It wasn't stuff that I was hearing on the radio all the time. Then the following year, I remember like getting all excited about, oh, it's my uncle gonna get me for Christmas. And came time to open up our records, and I open up my record. I'm kind of looking at it. I'm like, oh, what the hell is this? You know, last year you got me something kind of cool that I thought was different, and this year it's a record called Speaker Death. I'm like, Speaker Death? What the hell is that? And I turn it around, and it's like a sampler from a record label, like Epic Records or whatever. And as I'm looking at it, the only thing I'm recognizing on it is like Whitford St. Holmes, which is like, you know, Whitford St. Holmes was like Brad Whitford and Derek St. Holmes from the Ted Nugent Band, Brad Whitford from Aerosmith. I'm like, what the fuck, you know? It's like last year he got me something kind of cool. He knows what I'm into, you know? I've been listening to a little bit of punk rock lately. I look over at my cousin, and he's opened up his record, and he has the same kind of puzzled look on his face, like, what the fuck is this? And I'm looking at the record he got, and it was Gang of Four, Solid Gold. And at that point, I'm like kind of saying, hey, I go, Reed, what'd you get? And he's like, well, I got this record called Solid Gold, you know? And he's like, what'd you get? I'm like, well, I got this record called Speaker Death. And he's like, ooh, you know, let me check it out. And I'm like, you know, it's, hey, I got Whitford St. Holmes on it. He's like, really? So we end up swapping records, and later on that night, I took my drumsticks into the bedroom and sitting there, and I put on Gang of Four, and didn't really take to it at all, you know. I just kind of listened to it, and I'm like, what the fuck is it? You know, it's kind of really weird, you know. I wonder what that Whitford St. Holmes song sounds like. But as I put it on and kept listening to it, it's one of those records that totally grew on me, totally changed the way I listen to music, and you know, pretty much floored me, and still does to this day. So Gang of Four, Solid Gold, amazing record. Thanks. Speaker Death, you know, I don't know what happened to Speaker Death.
When we were kids, my dad had borrowed someone's like box set LPs of Benny Goodman. He loved Benny Goodman, still does. And we were all sleeping upstairs, and we heard something going on downstairs. So my dad was recording it, and he only had it for the night or something. We come downstairs, we're kind of groggy, and I'm like, Dad, what's going on? What's all the, why are you playing music? It's really late. He's like, oh, kids, you gotta hear this. You gotta hear this. It's great. It's the best, the most amazing music ever made. You gotta sit down. This guy's a genius. I borrowed this and I'm taping it. He's like doing cassette tapes, right? And you gotta hear it. You gotta hear it. Yeah, I think he had a couple cocktails in him, but he just was so excited and so passionate about it. It's like wanted us to hear it. It was the most important thing to him at that time. Well, for a while anyway. And he was very excited, and I just remember that emotion and that feeling he had, and how we were all just sitting there and all excited and like, Dad, this is great. This is really great, because we got to stay up late, so that was the exciting part. But it was just that feeling he had. It was so, I guess, yeah, it just was amazing. So.
The main source, Breaking Atoms album, was like one of the first albums to me that I found very inspiring and moderate and advanced and something to learn from. It was a total building block as far as music, concepts, the sampling methods, filtered bass lines, you know. It had a lot of key elements that people still use today. The beats, like how he replayed some songs, and then the loops and the drums, the concepts. He had a song called A Friendly Game of Baseball, which was dealing with the frustrations that African Americans deal with the police. It wasn't a real long album, but a lot of things, that was the springboard to a lot of things, a lot of concepts, a lot of artists, you know. He was definitely cutting edge at that time. And when people look back, they always talk about the Large Professor, because he was one of the first people who produced and rhymed, and he was good at both. You know what I'm saying? Like, some people could produce and they could rhyme okay, or they could rhyme good, but they didn't really make beats. Most rappers don't even make beats. Everybody that I know that's my age, like 30 or above, they pretty much rhyme and make beats. But the younger cats, they just rhyme, they look for some people to make beats. They had a posse rhyme on there, and the posse rhyme was Nas's debut, and Akinelli and Joe Fado. Yeah, so I had one of my favorite songs of all time on that album, which is called Hanging Out. Just a nice little slow beat to talk about hanging out. In the hook of the break, he rocked a reggae singing riff, which people today kind of rock singing riffs. It's just a lot of methods and techniques were used in that album that was way back that people still use today. Paul is the guy's name, Large Professor. He's not as well known now, but he's got a lot of respect.
I just sort of discovered jazz, and it's pretty easy when you're like 12 years old to like bebop, or, you know, jazz is pretty melodic and pretty rhythmically regular. But about 1972, they had a concert of the trumpeter Charles Tolliver leading a group that included Reggie Workman on bass, and that was a big deal. It was touted, you know, in the poster for the concert that Reggie Workman, who I guess best known for having played with Coltrane, was going to be part of this ensemble. So everybody went to it, but it was pretty out jazz. It was certainly by suburban standards. So I remember like trying really hard to like it and understand it, or like expecting to like it, but then finding it really challenging. It had a big rush of forward motion. Like I'm sure there was a drummer pounding away. It didn't have the sort of regular pulse or identifiable downbeat that you would get with, you know, with bop or with rock. It wasn't completely free, I don't think. Oh, okay. It had elements which seemed like stuff I should understand, improvised solos and a lot of percussive motion, and yet it differed from what I'd learned to like. There was a campus quartet that opened up that played more straight ahead bop or post bop, whatever, late 50s and early 60s style. And I remember finding that a lot. That was like what I understood jazz to be. So it was sort of the contrast between the two. It's kind of, I think, a landmark time in the history of jazz in a way. So it's kind of nice that it made its way out to this sort of suburban setting.
I was like a wannabe football hooligan when I was about 13 or 14. You know, I liked soccer, and I kind of wanted to be a football hooligan, but I had no taste for the violence or anything like that. But I liked the kind of the bravado of it. You know, it was almost like a kind of class consciousness about it. And then suddenly you had, I think that's what punk rock did as well. But even earlier than punk rock, people like Slade and T-Rex, and they kind of stripped music down to its real basics. It was like rock and roll again, and it was definitely, there was a kind of element of the lowest common denominator in there which appealed to, you know, a 13, 14-year-old boy. I think music at that point before that was so boring, you know? We all kind of thought about music as like, well, there's good music, but we're too young and stupid to understand that. That's like what our brothers listen to, you know? You got a big brother, he listens to like Yes, and maybe he listens to Bob Dylan, and maybe he listens to some other stuff, but we're not up there yet. We don't know about that, and we won't be able to understand that. But suddenly we had our own music, and it was definitely Slade for me. You know, I went out and started buying records, and it was just like very basic thumping rock. And then Bowie as well, you know. I always think my parents were, I always thought, you know, pretty brilliant really, because most of my heroes when I was a kid were kind of men dressed as women, and I had posters all over my walls of Mark Bolan and David Bowie and the guys out of Slade, you know, and they basically wore a lot of makeup, and but there was never any question in my mind that they were, you know, about the sexuality. It didn't make, you know, it wasn't really about that for me, but it was just very exciting. And I noticed like a lot of the football hooligans that I knew and admired kind of got into this music as well, and it wasn't like there was no kind of macho thing about it where, you know, it was quite cool for some sort of tough guy who kind of like, you know, left school and got a job on a building site to be like into David Bowie's like most extreme gender bending phases. You'd get a show like Top of the Pops and you'd listen to what was the mainstream on major labels at that time, and it's still pretty wild. I mean, I've got cassette recordings. I used to tape record those shows, you know, off the TV with my mother sitting there saying, "Dennis, be quiet, he's taping it." You know, my dad would like, oh, you know. And if you look at the list of bands, it's pretty radical sounding stuff, and it was the ultimate lowest common denominator mainstream thing. It was actually much further out there than anything you've got today, you know. I think, you know, the lid was on a lot less, you know, tight then, and it got a bit boring towards the end of the 70s, and that's what made punk rock happen. But, you know, as a 13-year-old boy, I was quite happy with the way things were in 1971 and 72, you know. It was pretty good.
The record I'm talking about is No Backup from Farmer's Manual. It's a Viennese band. It's a real electronica band. They are really into computer music in that way that they use the computers as source for their music and not just as a tool. It's a lot of the things have to do with random stuff, which has nothing to do with my music, but actually the effect or the sound they make is well, rather complex. To me it sounded like they recorded some real things or from field recordings or that stuff. I'm not sure if they really do, but it sounded to me like that. It's not just using synthesizers and that stuff. It's also sounds from the environment and sometimes real acoustic instruments, but in a crazy way. So I think they're unique in their sound. Well, you know, it's always hard to talk about influence because we always try to do our own stuff, but in fact I think of this record sometimes when I do music, and that's why I mentioned it, because there are some ideas in the music which are left in my head for years, because the record No Backup is really, I think, yeah, some years old. It's more from the beginning of electronica, I think. Not from the very beginning, but from the more abstract one in the 90s, and so. Well.
I was in New York, first year of college in 1975, end of 75. And I saw Patti Smith in Television and Talking Heads, you know, within a couple of months. I saw Don Cherry at the 5 Spot, and, you know, and a lot of great music really quick from coming here. I started hearing Pere Ubu's singles and then saw them really soon after that. So probably in I'm guessing like October 76, something like that, at Max's Kansas City. Hearing the singles in the summer and then seeing them live there really catalyzed me and some of my friends to start playing. You know, the whole idea of do it yourself and everything, you know, all appealed to me and made sense, but I couldn't imagine myself doing it. I hadn't played an instrument, and I was pretty stuck on the idea that you had to know what you were doing with the thing. In high school, I loved Zappa and Beefheart, and that was, I sort of almost had an idea that, you know, maybe something in there, you know, I could do something like that. David Thomas was bellowing and playing you know, some pieces of metals. That seemed doable. These guys do it in a way that, you know, that I could really understand how they were making music, that made me feel like I could do something. We started this band in the basement of our dorm that fall. The other 2 guys played guitar, so they had a head start on what they were up to. I was just banging on stuff in the basement at first, and then my friend Willie had a cousin who had some drums, so I accepted one of those, and we had this dressmaker's dummy that we put a cymbal on, and that was my original kit. But it was very much Pere Ubu, when I think about it, that got me thinking about doing it myself.
The first thing that came to my mind really was the West Side Story soundtrack, because I've experienced it on many levels. It was a thing that was playing around my house a lot when I was growing up. My mom was always listening to it, and it just really sparked my imagination. But there are several memories I have. One was the first time I ever looked at my mom as a lady. She was getting ready for a date with my stepdad, and I came into this room and she was sort of prancing about the room, singing the song I Feel Pretty to herself and humming, and she was just like really giddy and really, she was pretty sweet on him. And it just, experiencing the song in that way brought it to a whole different plane for me. It was a record that was easy for me to sort of project myself into it, and like, you know, I just hang around the house like singing along to America, like feeling my experience as a young New York Latina, you know, where I was like really this like doughy Jewish girl in Tennessee. And then, I don't know, the song about being a jet, and when you're a jet, and I was just, you know, I mean, basically I acted out all the songs on the soundtrack. And then later on, I like would reconsider some of the songs. Tom Waits did a cover of the ballad Somewhere, and when I was 17, my boyfriend, who I was quite in love with, moved away to Los Angeles from Knoxville, Tennessee, and he sent me a tape, a mixtape, and the first song on it was Tom Waits covering Somewhere. There's a place for us somewhere, and it was just broke my heart in a really good way. So that, I think that record is the thing that really seemed the most obvious thing to talk about. I have a really good story about being on acid and seeing Lynyrd Skynyrd.
Well, I was a young sound guy. I was working at Stashes in Columbus, and you know, Mo Tucker and the Velvet Underground on tour again. I was super nervous. Like, I think I was just nervous that like she would be like, you know, real demanding, and I wouldn't be able to like make her happy. She's a legend, so. And then she's back on tour. She like took time off to work at Walmart and raise a family, and then she was back out putting out records. You know, I spent like a couple extra hours tuning the PA. I brought in a special mic for her and sat there waiting, and they all showed up, half Japanese, and Mo Tucker, and they just basically load their gear on stage, and she just got up on stage and checked the mic, and it's like, okay, that's good, let's go eat, and they all left, and I was like, that's it? Surprisingly, yeah, it was super easy. She was really easy to get along with. She was just, you know, one of the band. It was her and half Japanese, like she was playing the little drums, singing a little guitar. They did cover of Pale Blue Eyes, she sang, which was awesome. They were opening up for Lou Reed the next night in Pittsburgh. They put me on the list, and I talked some friend of mine into driving all the way out to Pittsburgh, and we showed up and the show was canceled because Lou Reed just broke his foot, like riding his motorcycle. We drove all the way back, probably riding his Honda scooter.
I was like a wannabe football hooligan when I was about 13 or 14. You know, I liked soccer, and I kind of wanted to be a football hooligan, but I had no taste for the violence.
But then I picked up the saxophone after we moved to Chicago. I was living in Evanston at that particular time.
And every Sunday, they'd find me up there for Reuben to learn me chords on that guitar, because I didn't have no guitar, never had nobody to help me.
You could be cleaning the toilet and enjoy the fact that the result is a clean toilet on which everyone will be comfortable to sit on or to use in whatever.
Some are whack, some are dope, and then you start, hey man, now you know, it's like no one knows about these drums yet because everyone's like...
But it definitely scared me, and so there was this whole thing that, because they were such alarming women.
I mean, I grew up in a very poor, middle, upper class area.
I'm singing the song I Feel Pretty to herself and humming, and she was just like really giddy and really, it was a
pretty out jazz, or it was certainly by suburban standards.
I was like, man, what am I gonna do? What am I doing here? You know? And I actually had sort of a nervous breakdown. And I got to a point where I stopped.
Like she had said in a Rolling Stone interview that she wasn't a virgin. And I was like,
he looks like me. It's like, look at him go. Look at him pogo. Wow.
It gives me chicken skin just to think those words.
So the next day I went into my jewelry drawer where the babysitting money was, and I walked to Sam Goody in the mall, and I bought my very first Who album.
And this is maybe like the first or the second time I'd ever smoked pot.
Napoleon ice cream is multicultural. Like, Napoleon ice cream has these separate, distinct flavors, vanilla, chocolate, strawberry.
One thing I remember, one formative musical experience I remember vividly is we were at a friend's house. His parents were out of town, and his older brother was, he had a Kraftwerk record, and we put on the Kraftwerk record. Well, actually, we got stoned first, and this is maybe like the first or the second time I'd ever smoked pot. And we listened to the Kraftwerk record and danced around like robots the whole way through the record. But at one point, I blacked out and I fell onto the coffee table, and all the legs sort of shot out. We tried to fix it, but I think we wound up just saying that the cleaning lady broke it, which I guess I feel kind of bad about in hindsight.
I had a lot of inspiration over the years, obviously, growing up in the music and everything, but basically, as an adult and really getting into the conceptual thoughts of lyrics and everything, it was my man Ben Harper. I was first introduced to Ben Harper on BET, Bet on Jazz television. I used to always watch the Jazz Channel before I went to bed every night. I would just, throw it on because I love jazz music. I mean, I grew up playing the saxophone, so I always would listen to it, to Bet on Jazz. And I grew up in Gary, Indiana. And like out here, you can't get Bet on Jazz, but that was like turning channel 2 in Gary, in the urban area. So I just play it every night. And then like one morning I woke up really early, like 8 o'clock, and it was on. And I was like, wow, this dude's kind of fresh. And then very next, like 2 days later, 8 o'clock again, the same show was on showing his performance. I was like, they must really like him too. They must get good ratings when they show this thing early in the morning. When I look at the show and I see the people in the audience or the standing room, everybody's there is totally into it. They're singing every word with them, and that's got to be, for me as being an artist, that's inspirational in the sense of you would love to be at the point where the people that's at your show really, really, really want to be at your show, and they're really there for you, and they know every lyric. I mean, it's the most humbling thing to do is to be on stage and someone in the crowd know your lyrics. He's really speaking from the heart, from what I tell, I can tell from when I listen to a song. It's like he's not a trend or a fad. So it's kind of like, I'm listening to Ben Harper, in 2002, and I listened to Ben Harper in 1997, 98, and I know I'll be listening to Ben Harper in 2018, you know what I'm saying? I'll still listen to Fight to Your Mind 10 years from now. So it's kind of like a music that can stand the test of time because it has no, it's not a trendy or a faddish type thing. It's something that there's concepts and options in the music that can, that really can better a lot of things. So people just get into it. Truth, man, the truth, with a little strength behind it. A little strength behind it, yeah, for sure. Ben, if you ever see this, come do a song with me. I love to.
About 90 or 91 when we first moved to Chicago, and the Cocktails and I were all living in this loft, and we were building our own rooms, and it was a particularly bleak period with no hot water and a lot of noise from the passing L tracks and L train and everything like that. And since we set up in Chicago and we had a big space, people were passing through and staying with us. And this one friend of ours, Jeff from Kansas City, was coming through. Here we were in this bustling sort of common area, and he said, "You have to hear this." And he got out his bag, popped it in, and he was right. When he pressed play, it was right in the middle of a song by Nick Drake off of Brighter Later. It seemed like everybody was milling around, and to me, everything sort of became very quiet and heightened. He fast-forwarded it to the first song with vocals. When I first heard the vocals, I was just like, "Oh my God, who is this?" It was one of those things that just hit me right off. Something about the humble quality of his voice and the guitar playing. Of course, had to have the tape, which was taped off of an album that was skipping, and you could hear the pops and everything. So it you know, it was kind of nice to hear it first that way. And again, it's the kind of thing where you don't really, you cherish those kind of discoveries because they don't happen that often. It really was sort of like a moment trapped in time, you know.
Well, when I was in high school, I was first introduced to and then later met Milo Fine, and Milo's a improvising musician from Minneapolis, and he and guitarist Steve Janicka have been the Milo Fine Free Jazz Ensemble for I don't know how many years now, 30 years now. I had a friend bring me to